The first frost of October had already kissed the high ridges above Harrow Creek when Clara Devane stepped off the stagecoach and into a town that didn't quite know what to make of her. She was young, 24, maybe 25, with ink-stained fingers and a leather satchel full of grammar books. The schoolhouse had been without a teacher for nearly 2 years, ever since old Mr. Grady had packed his things and left without so much as a goodbye. The children of Harrow Creek had been running half-wild ever since, and the town council had finally done something about it. Clara wasn't what anyone expected. She was too direct in her gaze, too unbothered by mud, and she asked questions the way some people drew guns, fast, without warning, and with no apparent concern for the consequences. She had been in town exactly 4 days when she met Caleb Morrow. He was standing outside the general store, loading flour sacks onto a flatbed wagon with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done the same thing 1,000 times. 60 years old if he was a day, broad-shouldered, with silver hair cut close and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same granite that framed the valley. He didn't look up when she approached. He didn't have to. "Mr. Morrow," she said, because she had already learned his name. Everyone in Harrow Creek knew his name. "I've been told you're the one to speak to about the schoolhouse roof." He set down a sack and turned. His eyes were a pale, steady gray, the kind that didn't flinch. "You were told right," he said. "I also heard," she continued, tilting her head slightly, "that you've lived alone on that ridge for 30 years. Never married." The street didn't go quiet, but it felt like it did. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Not with anger. Not with surprise. With something closer to recognition, as if he had been waiting all this time for someone to finally say it out loud. "That's right," he said. "Why?" One word. Clean and simple as a blade. The two men leaning against the post office wall suddenly found something interesting to study on the ground. The woman sweeping the mercantile steps slowed her broom. Even the horse tied to the rail seemed to pause. Caleb Morrow picked up another flour sack. He didn't answer right away. And when he did, his voice was so low that only Clara, standing just 3 feet away, could hear it. "That," he said, "is a story I haven't told anyone in this town." He set the sack on the wagon, climbed up to the bench, and clicked the reins. Clara stood in the street and watched him go. She would find out. That much was already decided. "Stay with me, because what Caleb Morrow finally says will change the way you see everything that came before." Harrow Creek had a story about Caleb Morrow, the way small towns always have stories about the men who live just far enough outside their reach. The version most people told went like this. Caleb had come to Montana in the spring of 1851, barely 20 years old, with nothing but a mule, a bedroll, and a deed to a square mile of land his father had won in a card game. He had built his homestead board by board, season by season, on a ridge above the creek that flooded every April and froze every November and demanded everything a man had just to keep standing. He had turned that hard ground into one of the most respected cattle operations in the valley. He paid his debts on time, settled disputes without lawyers, and showed up when neighbors needed hands for a barn raising or a hard winter. He was in every visible way a good man. And he was alone. That part, the part the town didn't discuss directly, was treated as a personal decision. A quirk of character. "Some men just aren't built for it," the blacksmith, Holt Ferris, once said, and most people had nodded and let it go at that. But Clara Devane was not most people. In her first week, she had done what any good teacher does. She had listened. She had taken her meals at the boarding house run by Mrs. Prentice, a woman of 60 who had lived in Harrow Creek since before it had a proper name. She had walked the length of the main street twice a day, nodding at shopkeepers and asking questions that seemed innocent until they weren't. What she found was a man who had quietly shaped the town without ever stepping into the center of it. The schoolhouse roof. Caleb had paid for half the timber, anonymously, until the lumber merchant let it slip. The widow alderman's well, which had been dug the winter after her husband died. Caleb's hands, Caleb's tools, no payment asked or given. The church's bell, which rang every Sunday morning across the valley, donated in 1871, no name on the plaque. "He doesn't want credit," Mrs. Prentice had said, refilling Clara's coffee without being asked. "Never did." "Then what does he want?" Clara had asked. Mrs. Prentice had set down the pot and looked out the window toward the ridge. "I don't think he lets himself want things anymore," she said. "Not since—" She stopped. Clara waited. "Not since before your time," Mrs. Prentice finished, and picked up the pot again. That pause, that careful, deliberate silence, told Clara more than any answer would have. There was a name that hadn't been spoken. A door that had been shut for 30 years and that the entire town had agreed, without saying so, to leave closed. Clara had been taught, in her schooling back in Ohio, that the past was something you studied from a safe distance. She was beginning to suspect that in Harrow Creek, the past was still very much alive. It came to her in pieces, the way truth usually does in small towns, not announced, but leaked. Through silences and half-sentences and the particular way certain people changed the subject when she got too close. The first piece came from the post office. Clara had gone in to register her address for correspondence, and while the postmaster, a thin man named Gerald Oakes, was writing in his ledger, she noticed something on the wall behind him. It was a small wooden frame, sun-bleached and slightly crooked, holding a hand-lettered notice that looked at least 20 years old. Most of the text had faded, but 2 words near the top were still dark enough to read: Harvest Social. And beneath it, in smaller letters, music by R. Aldcott and the Morrow brothers. She stared at it long enough that Gerald noticed. "Old notice," he said, without looking up. "From 58 or 59, I think. Before the war." "The Morrow brothers," Clara said. "Caleb had a brother?" Gerald set down his pen. "Had Thomas. Younger by 3 years." He paused. "Fever took him in 63. "I'm sorry," Clara said. "Caleb took it hard." Gerald went back to his ledger. "But that wasn't the hardest thing that year." She waited. He didn't continue. The second piece came from the schoolhouse itself. She had been sorting through the storage closet at the back of the room, a jumble of old slates, broken chalk, and forgotten lesson books, when she found, tucked behind a loose board at the bottom of the shelf, a small envelope. Unsealed. Inside was a single card, the kind exchanged at dances or church socials, with a woman's handwriting in careful, looping script. "See, I will be at the creek crossing at sundown. Please come." The ink was brown with age. The paper had softened at the edges, as though it had been handled many times before being hidden away. Clara turned the card over. Nothing on the back. No date. No last name. Just R. She sat on the schoolhouse steps that afternoon and thought about a woman who wrote a note and hid it in a place where only someone who knew to look would find it. The third piece came from an unexpected direction. Harrow Creek had a physician, if you could call him that, named Dr. Amos Cutter, who was 70 years old, mostly retired, and spent his afternoons on the bench outside his office whittling small horses out of pine. Clara had made a point of introducing herself to everyone in town, and Dr. Cutter had been the most forthcoming of all of them, right up until she mentioned Caleb's name. Then he went quiet in a different way. Not the silence of ignorance. The silence of a man who knows exactly what he's not going to say. "Caleb Morrow," he said slowly, turning a half-finished horse in his hands, "is about the most private man I have ever known. And I have known him for 40 years. But you know why he never married?" Clara said. Dr. Cutter looked at her over his glasses. "I know a version of it," he said. "The town knows a version of it. I suspect the true version is the one only Caleb knows." He paused. "And maybe one other person." "Who?" He set the wooden horse on the bench beside him and stood up slowly. "Her name was Ruth Calloway," he said. "And that is all I'm going to say about it." He walked inside and closed the door. Clara stood on the street with a name, finally. Just a name. But names have weight. And this one, Ruth Calloway, landed in her chest like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples in every direction. Clara made a mistake. She knew it the moment she made it, and she made it anyway, which is the particular character of the mistakes that cost us the most. She had gone to see Holt Ferris, the blacksmith, on the pretense of asking about horseshoe suppliers for the school's one aging cart pony. Holt was the kind of man who filled silences naturally, without thinking about what he was filling them with. It took less than 10 minutes. Ruth Calloway, Holt said, hammering without pausing, was the prettiest woman this valley ever saw. Everyone knew it. Caleb knew it. And the whole town knew he was going to ask for her hand. What happened? Claire asked. He didn't. Holt shrugged, as if the conclusion were obvious. Spring of 1863. Thomas was already gone by then. Ruth had been waiting, everyone could see it, and Caleb just never came. She waited through the summer. By fall, she'd accepted a proposal from a rancher from up north. Married him the following year. Clara felt something cold move through her. He just didn't come, she said. That's what everyone saw, Holt said. And Caleb never explained himself. Never said a word. Just kept working that ridge like he always had. He set down his hammer and looked at her. You ask me, a man who lets a woman like that go without a word of explanation is a man who made his choice. Town respected him for his work. Never quite forgave him for that. Clara thanked him and left. She went straight to the ridge. Caleb was in the corral when she arrived, working with a young horse, moving with the careful patience of a man who understood that trust is built in small increments or not at all. He saw her coming and finished what he was doing before he walked to the fence. You've been asking questions, he said. It wasn't an accusation. You didn't answer mine, she said. He studied her for a moment. The afternoon light caught the lines on his face, the kind that come not just from weather but from years of holding something heavy without ever setting it down. What did they tell you? He asked. That you let her go without a word. He nodded slowly. That's what they saw. Is it what happened? He was quiet for a long time. The horse moved along the fence rail. Somewhere down the valley, a hawk cried once and went silent. No, he said. It is not what happened. Clara had acted on half the truth. She had come up here half convinced she understood him, half convinced the town's version was right. That half conviction sat in her chest now like a splinter. Then tell me, she said. He looked at the mountains. Come back tomorrow, he said. Morning. Bring your coffee. I only tell this once. Stay with me. Because what Caleb Morrow said the next morning is not the story anyone in Harrow Creek believed, and once you hear it, you won't be able to unhear it either. Clara arrived at the ridge before 7. The valley below was still wrapped in low mist, the creek a silver thread through the gray-green meadows. Caleb had a fire going outside, 2 cups already poured. He handed her one without ceremony and sat on an upturned crate and looked at the mountains the way men look at things they have long since made their peace with. He spoke without preamble. I came to Harrow Creek in the spring of 1851, he said. Ruth Calloway's family had been here 2 years already. Her father ran the first trading post, before the general store, before any of it. She used to come in the mornings to open up while her father slept. I'd be the first customer, most days. We talked. Clara said nothing. By 1855 we understood each other in the way that doesn't need a lot of words. I had land. I was building. I intended to ask for her hand in the spring of 57. He paused. But in the winter of 56, her father's trading post failed. He had borrowed from a man named Stokes, out of Billings, and when the post went under, Stokes came to collect. Caleb turned the cup slowly in his hands. Stokes had a son, Edmund, 30 years old, established, with 2 ranches and connections north into Canada. Stokes offered Ruth's father a way out of the debt, all of it, cleared, on one condition. Ruth would marry Edmund. The fire crackled. The mist shifted below them. Her father came to me, Caleb said. Not to ask permission. To ask me to step aside. He said if I proposed to Ruth before the arrangement was settled, Stokes would call the debt immediately and they'd lose everything. He asked me to wait. He set down his cup. So I waited. And while I was waiting, Edmund Stokes started courting her in the open, and the town started to understand things a certain way. And then Thomas got sick. Clara looked at him. I was with Thomas from January to May of 1863, Caleb said quietly. Every day. Ruth knew. She came to the house twice. I turned her away because I didn't want her near the fever. The second time she came, Edmund Stokes was with her. He had already spoken to her father. She looked at me through the window and I told her to go. He was silent for a moment. She thought I was refusing her, he said. I was trying to keep her alive. He exhaled. By the time Thomas was gone, she had accepted Edmund's proposal. She married him 6 months later. And I never explained because... He stopped. Because? Claire asked. Because she had made her choice, he said. And I had made mine. And telling the truth after the fact would have done nothing except hurt her and made me look like I was asking for credit. Clara set down her own cup. She had come up here the day before half convinced of one thing, and now she sat with a story so different from the town's version that it felt like learning the name of a river and then discovering it flows the other direction. She never knew, Clara said. No, he said. She never knew. The mist below them was beginning to lift. The valley floor showed itself, field by field, in the morning light. Did you ever love anyone else? Claire asked. The question surprised even her. Caleb looked at her, not unkindly, not with distance, with something that was simply honest. I haven't let myself find out, he said. Clara walked back down the ridge slowly. She had come to Harrow Creek with a satchel full of grammar books and no intention of becoming part of anyone's history. She taught fractions and penmanship and the capitals of the 38 states, and she had expected that to be enough. It was not going to be enough. The problem was not that she now knew Caleb Morrow's truth. The problem was that his truth sat inside her like something alive, and she didn't know yet what to do with something alive. She had 3 choices the way she saw it. She could say nothing. Let the town go on believing what it believed, let Caleb go on carrying what he carried, let the whole thing settle back into the silence where it had lived for 30 years. It was the safe choice. It was the choice of someone who understood that other people's lives were not her business. She had never been particularly good at safe choices. She could tell people. Not as gossip. Clara did not deal in gossip, but as a correction. There was something in her that resisted a story told wrong, the way a schoolteacher resists a misspelled word on a slate. The town had formed a picture of Caleb Morrow that was not accurate, and inaccuracy had always bothered her in the particular way it bothers people who believe the truth has value independent of whether it is comfortable. But the third choice was the one she kept returning to. She could tell Ruth. Ruth Calloway, Ruth Stokes now, or perhaps widowed herself by this point, she didn't know, was somewhere. People didn't vanish in the West. They moved north or south or west and left traces. Dr. Cutter knew. Mrs. Prentice probably knew. Somebody in Harrow Creek knew where Ruth Stokes had gone. Clara stopped in the middle of the trail. She thought about what Caleb had said. She had made her choice. And I had made mine. She thought about a woman who had written a note, "Please come," and hidden it in a schoolhouse shelf, and about a man who had stood at a sick brother's bedside and turned away the woman he loved to protect her from fever. She thought about 30 years. And then she thought about something Caleb had said that she hadn't been able to stop hearing since he said it. I haven't let myself find out. Not I don't. Not I can't. Not it's too late. I haven't let myself. That was not the statement of a man who had finished grieving. That was the statement of a man who had never allowed himself to begin. Clara started walking again. Faster, this time. She had a decision to make. Not about Ruth. Ruth was a woman with her own life, her own history, her own choices, and it was not Clara's place to disturb them. The decision was about herself. Whether she was the kind of woman who could sit across from a man like Caleb Morrow, stubborn and quiet and bone-deep decent, and simply let what she felt remain unacknowledged in the interest of keeping things simple. She already knew the answer to that. She had never been particularly good at simple, either. It happened the way these things often happen in small towns. Not with a dramatic announcement, but with a shift in temperature. It began with Dr. Cutter. Clara had gone to see him the morning after her second visit to the ridge, not to demand he tell her more, but to tell him what she now knew. She sat across from him in his narrow office and told him Caleb's story, not as gossip, but as a record, the way a teacher transfers knowledge from one generation to the next. When she finished, the old doctor was quiet for a long time. I suspected something like it, he said finally. I never knew the Stokes piece. He took off his glasses and set them on his desk. 30 years, he said softly. 30 years and that man never said a word. He didn't want credit, Clara said. His words. Dr. Cutter put his glasses back on. He never does. He looked at her carefully. Why are you telling me? Because you're the one person in this town with the standing to say it matters, she said. I'm a stranger here. A schoolteacher who's been in Harrow Creek 3 weeks. No one is going to change how they think about Caleb Morrow because the new teacher says so. Dr. Cutter studied her for a moment. But they might, she continued, if someone they've trusted for 40 years quietly corrects the record. He was silent again. Then he picked up the half-finished wooden horse on his desk and turned it in his hands. You're more strategic than you look, he said. I'm a teacher, she said. We work with what we have. What followed was not a town meeting or a public declaration. It was quieter than that, the way truth moves when it moves honestly. In conversation, in revised understanding, in the particular look that crosses a person's face when they realize the story they believed was missing something essential. Holt Ferris heard it from his wife, who heard it from Mrs. Prentice, who heard it from Dr. Cutter over Sunday dinner. The postmaster, Gerald Oakes, stopped in at the general store one Thursday morning and told the owner, who told 2 customers. By the second week of November, the revised version of Caleb Morrow's story had moved through Harrow Creek the same way his acts of quiet generosity always had, without announcement, without spectacle, simply becoming part of what people knew. Some reacted with straightforward recalibration. They had thought one thing, now they thought another, and they adjusted accordingly. Others felt something more complicated. Holt Ferris, who had spoken the most plainly about Caleb's supposed failure, was seen nodding slowly when the subject came up, and he said nothing for a long time before saying, "A man keeps a thing like that to himself for 30 years, he deserves more credit than I gave him." And that was the end of it. Caleb himself said nothing about any of it. He came into town the following Saturday for supplies, the same as he always did, and if people looked at him differently, he gave no indication of noticing. But when he came out of the general store and found Clara standing by his wagon, she had not planned it that way, she had simply been walking past. He stopped and looked at her, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before. Not softness, exactly. Something that had been held under pressure for a very long time, just barely beginning to release. "Mrs. Prentice told me you spoke to Cutter," he said. "I did," Clara said. He loaded a bag of oats and said nothing for a moment. "Why?" he asked. Not accusatory. Genuinely curious. "Because it was a better story than the one they had," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The October wind came down from the ridge and moved the dust along the street. "You could have left it alone," he said. "I could have," she agreed. He loaded the last bag and closed the wagon gate. "Come to supper Sunday," he said. "If you're not otherwise engaged." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was the kind of invitation that a man makes when he has decided, carefully, deliberately, to allow himself to find out. "I'll be there," Clara said. Montana, November 1882. The snow came early that year to Harrow Creek, not the light, provisional snow of October, but the real thing, heavy and serious, the kind that settled into the valley and announced it intended to stay. The ridge above town disappeared into white. The creek slowed. The morning smelled of wood smoke and cold air and pine. Clara Devane had been in Harrow Creek for 7 weeks. In that time she had repaired the schoolhouse roof with timber Caleb Morrow arranged without being asked. She had taught 21 children, ranging from age 5 to 14, to read, to cipher, and to spell the names of every state in the Union. She had earned the guarded respect of a town that did not give it easily, and she had made one genuine friend in Mrs. Prentice, who set an extra plate at breakfast every morning without comment. And she had taken supper at the Ridge on 5 Sunday evenings. They were not evenings of obvious romance. There was no music, no candlelight borrowed from a more obliging genre of story. There was elk stew and bread and strong coffee and the particular kind of conversation that happens between 2 people who are both, at their core, observers, people who have spent more time watching the world than demanding things of it. Caleb talked about the land, about the way the valley changed season to season, decade to decade, and what those changes told you about what was coming. He talked about Thomas, carefully at first, then with more ease, about the way his brother had laughed, about the fiddle Thomas had played, About the winter they had built the house together and argued for 3 days about the direction the door should face. Clara talked about Ohio, about the schoolhouse where she herself had learned to read, about the teacher who had first told her that a well-placed question was more powerful than any answer. "Is that what you were doing?" Caleb asked one evening. "When you asked me in the street that first day?" "I was curious," she said. "You were strategic," he said. And there was something in his voice, not accusation, but recognition, the same word Dr. Cutter had used, that made her laugh. She had not expected him to be funny. She had not expected a great many things about Caleb Morrow. She had not expected, for instance, the way he listened. Not politely, not with the partial attention of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but completely, the way a man listens who has learned, over many decades of solitude, that what people say and what they mean are two entirely different things, and that the space between them is where the real information lives. She had not expected the evening on the fourth Sunday, when the first snow came and she stayed later than she intended, and he walked her halfway down the ridge trail with a lantern, and at the point where the town lights came into view he stopped and said, without looking at her, "I don't know how to do this anymore. If I ever did." And she said, without missing a beat, "I don't think it requires knowing. I think it requires deciding." He had looked at her then. The lantern light moved across his face and she saw, very clearly, a man in the act of deciding. He did not say anything else that night. He didn't need to. This is what the West was, beneath all its hardness and dust and silence. A place where people carried things for decades without setting them down, not because they were weak, but because they had nowhere safe to put them. And sometimes, not often but sometimes, someone arrived who made a space that felt safe enough. Caleb Morrow had loved once with everything he had and had given it up without a word because he believed it was the right thing. He had carried that decision alone through 30 winters on a ridge above a creek in Montana, and he had never asked anyone to understand it, and he had never stopped believing it had been the right thing, even when it cost him everything. That kind of love doesn't announce itself. It doesn't perform. It just holds. Quiet and absolute. For as long as it takes. Clara Devane had come west to teach children their letters. She had not come to find a man who had spent 30 years learning, in the hardest possible way, what it actually means to love someone. But the West has always had a talent for giving people things they didn't know they were looking for.